sculpture in order to plan for your metal projects that you will create on the CNC plasma cutter. So let's go ahead and start by defining what planar sculpture is. With planar sculpture, we're talking about using surface, and we're talking about using large areas of physical material. In our case, it will be 18 by 24 sheet metal. So with this project, you will create a planar sculpture using sheet metal and planar construction. The objectives are to explore visual relationships between two-dimensional abstract composition and three-dimensional form, to study linear, planar, positive, negative, light and dark, and spatial relationships, to work within stated bounds of the problem, designing 3D sculptural form using flat planes, to develop an awareness of art historical context and resources, to develop knowledge of fabricating processes and skills. I recommend creating a model from paper or cardboard, or you can even use Tinkercads. It's really helpful when you do a 2-scale model because you can take the sheets of paper and you can directly put them on the metal just to kind of see, where things are laying out. We can also scan the paper model parts and we can trace them in Corel Draw and then physically cut them out using the CNC plasma cutter. So remember that these sculptures need to work in the round. I know a lot of people have been interested in working more two-dimensionally, but I really want you to think about how you can activate the viewer and utilize the 360 of sculpture. So with this project, you're going to learn some new skills. First will be the cutting and bending of metal, pop riveting. You'll use the CNC plasma cutter and the MIG welder. Some really good references for some artists. We can reference architecture once again, and I've listed several people on this slide here. Especially look for pieces of architecture that have bent and folded planes. Those are going to be really helpful for coming up with ideas for your project. So let's just look at some different types of architecture and planes. You think about density, and you can also think about how there's kind of a mix between, really dense mass happening in this piece of architecture, but then there's also a light airiness with the way the windows are being utilized. You can think about like the bolts and the bends and folds that you see in different pieces of furniture to give you influences. Other pieces of planar architecture like Peter Eidsman, Richard Meyer, the way he's just subtly using planes. Buckminster Fuller using planes in more of a geometric type shape. Frank Gehry. And now we're starting to see more complicated versions where you're seeing repeated pattern, shape, texture in order to create really interesting planes. Varying shapes, varying bends, like this Frank Gehry piece of architecture. Another handy thing to think about too is, how you can use like the textural surface for the CNC plasma cutter. So here are a bunch of different designs that I found online that other artists have used to give you guys some ideas on how to go about this. So essentially you can do, pretty much any shapes that you want. You just have to consider that the plasma cutter can't do super thin, delicate lines like the laser cutter can. So, just whenever you're planning your pieces, don't make parts that are super thin. You want to stick with more thick designs. You could also think about how the planes kind of fasten together, so like our architecture project, a lot of people built things in parts that were meant to assemble, so you can definitely think in that mindset for this project as well. Thinking in layers. Now this is more of an example that would be good for the laser, but that whole layering concept can definitely apply with the metal. And here's some other examples of planar sculpture in cardboard. So again, thinking about the planes, interior, exterior space, textures, how you could use your parts to assemble something that really lives in the 360. So these are all really good examples of some things to think about. How to treat the surfaces. Again, here's some familiar examples. Like we went over Diana Al Hadid last project quite a bit. Another great example, Mary Bates Neubauer. Again, thinking in planes to create a sculpture that's in the 360. But our plasma cutter can do some pretty cool stuff. So, really think about how you could use your planes to create these really interesting relationships. Now, let's also talk about the way we're going to put the metal together. And there's a couple different ways we can do that. So, riveting is one way, and that is a cold connection where you drill a hole into two different pieces of metal and then you put a pop rivet in. And I'll be showing you how to do that. Sheet metal screws is another way. So these particular screws have a tapping device on the bottom part of it that makes it be able to go through sheet metal. And then welding. And the type of welding we're going to learn is called MIG welding, which essentially it's kind of like using a hot glue gun but for metal. And it's pretty fun when you get some practice in on doing it. So we'll learn how to do that. And here's just some helpful tips as far as, how to go about this project. So making a paper model, figuring out your connection points for your metal, figure out what you like to use to connect to your metal. So think about the aesthetics. Is it important for the hardware that you're using to show? When planning your design, avoid making small cuts or areas that are super tight. The CNC plasma cutter will fuse the lines that are too tight and will not cut out your design. Refer to design examples such as variety, rhythm, balance, emphasis, proportion, scale, and balance to help influence your design. And then the big questions I always ask with every project is, what do you want your viewer to get out of your work, and who is your audience? So definitely take all these things in consideration, and I'm looking forward to seeing what you make.